Let's look at housing now. The housing standoff in Parliament continues. The Greens and Coalition still refusing to pass legislation to establish the Labor government's $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund. It's a blow for the government, given the Housing Fund was one of its key election promises. Anthony Albanese has ruled out any changes to negative gearing despite this internal push for reform. Joining me live now is Independent Senator David Pocock. Good to see you, first of all, Senator.
Morning, Laura.
This package that's stalled in the Senate, it's important, but it's such a small part of it. When you look at the housing crisis as a whole, pretty much right across the country, what do you think needs to be done?
Mm-hmm. You're right, it's not enough. I've been very clear with the government that a $10 billion fund may sound a lot, but we've got a $21 billion fund to fund medical research. We've got a $15 billion fund to invest in manufacturing. So $10 billion on housing, which will hopefully spit out $500 million a year, is not really going to touch the sides when it comes to the scale of the crisis. So I would like to see them be more ambitious, but I'm not going to stand in the way of this. And I really hope that they can find some sort of middle ground with the Greens so that this does pass. But clearly this needs to be part of a much bigger conversation, and that comes down to things like supply in cities and some of the long sort of waits we're seeing for approvals. But I think we also need to have a conversation about tax and some of the generous tax concessions on investment properties, which the major parties don't seem willing to even have.
So you're talking about negative gearing there?
I think the capital gains tax discount and looking at negative gearing, not necessarily getting rid of it, but putting some limits around it and potentially shaping it to actually benefit renters. At the moment, things like solar, there's really no incentive as a landlord to put solar on. We could really compress the depreciation on solar panels, and I think you'd see a lot more landlords actually putting them on, which will benefit renters. But I think as part of this too, we need to be talking about capital gains tax, looking at negative gearing, but also looking at the rights that renters have in Australia. We're so far behind so much of the developed world when it comes to the length of leases, what renters can and can't do. And I think as more and more people are renting, particularly young people, many who feel like they're never going to be able to own a home, we need to be strengthening those rights for renters.
Well, what about rental caps? Is that something you support, or you're a bit more apprehensive about that?
No, it's not something. Freezing rents is not something I support. Here in the ACT, they mandate how much rents can go up by a year. But putting a freeze on rents, to me, that is just putting a Band-Aid on, and we're going to have to pay the price down the line. I'd really like the major parties to actually take this seriously. We are seeing a housing crisis across the country, and that is not being helped by what we're seeing in the construction sector with building companies going under and having no security of payments for subcontractors and tradies who've already done work. That is really
hurting too. I think you're right. But Senator, also something that I don't think any state jurisdiction is willing to talk about as well is Airbnb and short-term rentals. I mean, there's a lot of suburbs where you can go on, you can hardly find anything to rent long-term, but you go on Airbnb and there are hundreds in the same area. Surely something needs to be done there.
I agree. I think we should be looking at all of these areas. My understanding, talking to experts, is with Airbnbs across the board, potentially not as big a problem as you'd think, but in specific areas, an enormous problem in your sort of holiday hotspots and those sorts of places. So something that we should be looking at. Another one is, I think, foreigners buying Australian property as an investment. That is probably something that we should look at. We've seen Canada really grapple with that and take steps to put some limits around that, where Australians are getting priced out of their own market. So I think all of these things need to be looked at and on the table. And yes, a lot of them are state and territory issues, but the federal government gives states and territories a lot of money through the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement So there are ways to actually ensure that states and territories are stepping up when it comes to things like Airbnbs, renters' rights. But then also, I think really importantly, it's something that I'm really frustrated that the new government doesn't seem that keen to act on, is security of payments. How can we allow tradies to carry the can and not get paid for work that they've already done?
Yep, I think what you're saying there is the federal government certainly has some leverage on things that the states have control over. Before I let you go, also Rugby Union has used their leverage, getting behind the Yes campaign in a big way. What's your reaction to that?
I thought it was a really well thought out and powerful statement issued by the board. There's different views on this. I think sport is at its best when it's part of these conversations, challenging society to think bigger. And you've got to remember that athletes have families, they're part of communities, and the Uluru Statement from the Heart is such a generous offer to all Australians. I think it's a great thing for sports who've benefited so much from First Nations athletes over the years, and sport has a long history of being involved in these sorts of changes and struggles. So I welcome it from Rugby Australia.
David Pocock, great to have you on the program. We'll get you back soon.
Thanks, Laura. Cheers.